Good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy days to log on and, watch what I have to present here. So first off, my name is Corey McKinney. I'm a conservationist for the Iowa Soybean Association. And over about the last year and a half here, we have been working with the West Buttrick Creek watershed to create a watershed plan that I'm going to discuss today. And one of the scenarios we chose and kind of how us here at Iowa Soybean does our watershed planning process, what goes into it, and kind of a brief overview. So as I'm going through this, please feel free to send a message in the chat if you have any questions, or at the end, my contact information will be there, and I'll touch back in on that. But please feel free to send me an email or a phone call. I'd love to chat with you about it. So let's get her started. So for starters here, I'm just going to go over some brief characteristics of the watershed, as well as, and then kind of touch on some of our planning framework and how we do this. So West Buttrick Creek, as you can see there, is located just west of Peyton. It's about just over 26,000 acres. Majority of it is in Greene County. So you can see the outline of the watershed there, as well as the main stem of the stream, which is that blue line that kind of flows up through the middle of the watershed there. So if we zoom out and kind of look how West Buttrick Creek falls into, other watersheds throughout the state. So the red outline is the West Buttrick, and then the yellowish, it could be kind of orange, I suppose, is the larger Buttrick Creek watershed, and then both of those fall within the Raccoon River watershed, which would be that grayer outline, starts all the way down there in Polk here, just south of our office in Des Moines, stretches all the way up into Pocahontas, Buena Vista County, and kind of covers a nice swath through western central Iowa there. So before I dig too much into the characterization of the watershed and how we do it, I kind of want to go through this chart here that outlines pretty well what we look for when we do a watershed plan, how kind of what we're thinking and what path we follow. So first off, we do that watershed characterization. That's some of the slides that are coming up. I'm going to talk with you about that. And then secondly, probably one of the most important parts on here is that stakeholder involvement. So whenever I talk about stakeholders, I mean anybody in the watershed that's got a piece to throw on the table and is part of the game. So that could be producers, landowners, cities, counties, that list can go on and on. So we want to make sure that those people are involved because number one, they're the ones that are going to carry the watershed plan out once the plan and the kind of proposal has been submitted, as well as they're the ones that we need to create the watershed plan with. They know their watershed the best. They know what practices are going to work, what practices may not work, and how maybe we could bridge some of those gaps to get that, that ball rolling and get closer and closer to our soil and water conservation needs or goals. So then the next step down would be that goal development. So we have those stakeholders, talk about what are their concerns with the watershed, as well as what have we done well in the past. So to figure out where we want to go, we need to know where we're at. So that's kind of the important piece. We need to figure out what are our goals and then kind of build this whole watershed plan around those goals. Once we kind of discover those goals and we go towards, what are ways that we can tackle those goals? And this is where I refer to a lot of that conservation toolbox, right? There's a lot of tools out there that do a lot of different jobs. Same with there's a lot of conservation practices that can provide benefits to our soil and water conservation goals. So whenever we have our goals determined, we need to figure out what tools we need to tackle those. So we kind of need to fill that conservation toolbox and maybe also figure out if there's new tools that can do a job much easier and much proficient, that maybe there's an education gap there that we need to work on and get people familiar with these tools and how to use them. So then once we figure out, our goals, how are we going to tackle them, we need to move to that resources component. So that resources can be funding, it can be technical assistance, it can be a variety of different ways to help carry out those tools to reach our goals. So that's kind of that next step. And currently we're probably right in between that, approaches for meeting goals and acquiring resources. So we know our goals, we know how we want to reach them, so we make this watershed plan, right? It's our roadmap to get to that endpoint. So next step, we need to get those resources to help our producers and implement some of these ideas that we have. And that's where it goes into the implementation. And then lastly, we want to reevaluate, monitor, make sure our practices are working right. If there needs to be some tweaking that needs to be done, or maybe mold that roadmap or take a different route, you know, and change that watershed plan and make sure it's going to do its best for the watershed and the people and producers and landowners that live within it. So that's very brief. That's a very brief overview. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out or send a chat. So whenever I talked about, you know, stakeholders kind of determining those goals, right? So what we did is we had a series of meetings, 3 meetings to be exact. Producers, landowners, all those stakeholders would attend those meetings. And through those meetings, we would kind of drum out what these goals could be. So on the left, you see an activity that we did. It was as simple as we had a large sticky note on the wall. We had everyone in the meeting kind of, you know, jot down what improvements could be made in the watershed, and kind of stick those up there. And then we discussed those. And from those improvements that could be made, we kind of created this topic and issues aspect. So we have those different categories listed on there, from water quality, tillage, you know, education, outreach, productivity, engagement. And we gave everyone in the meeting 3 blue dots, and they were able to go up and vote. You know, what are some of these priority topics or issues that we need to focus on, so that we can kind of mold this together, maybe consolidate some, and create these overarching goals that can somewhat be the framework and essentially be our ending point for our roadmap. So then we can create our path to get there. So through these activities, we did come up with 4 goals. Like I said, some of them are consolidated, but these 4 goals, for the most part, kind of capture everything that was brought up in those meetings. So the first one is improve water quality. You know, if you can remember the last slide, there was a lot of dots on there, and improve water quality is a very, you know, big umbrella. There's a lot of aspects underneath that, but we want our goals to be large and overarching. So there's different avenues and aspects and ways that we can accomplish those. Number 2, we want to increase resilience of water management. We want to build soil health, which is kind of, you know, that base, that framework to soil and water conservation. And then 4, we want to inform farmers and public of conservation practices and initiatives. So that, you know, that 4th bullet, you know, really focuses on, you know, that education gap as well as that funding potential, you know, letting those farmers know, you know, what is out there to help them, you know, get their feet wet, per se, or get that ball rolling. So next, before I go into this roadmap, per se, that we designed, I want to talk briefly about the watershed characteristics. I'm sure majority of you are way more familiar with this than I am, but this is kind of how we wrap our head around it and know exactly what we're working with. So I like to share some of this stuff. So first off, we have a slope map here, right? So the slopes start everywhere from those lighter yellows to those cream colors, which is that A and B slopes, so that 0 to 5%, all the way up to those darker purples, which you don't see too much of, which is in that 25% more, or that 18, those F slopes, 18 to 25. So 89% of the watershed has slopes less than 5%. That's fairly common for the area we're talking. You know, a lot of flat ground. So as you can see, a lot of yellow across that map. We obviously see some of those colors when we get closer to that stream, or that main channel that runs through the watershed. We see some of that elevation change, and maybe some of those gullies and ridges kind of flowing down into the bottom. So, you know, we can look at slopes, we can look at soil types, and we can look at location and determine, you know, what soils are what a lot of people call HEL, right? So highly erodible land. So this map here projects all the highly erodible soils as well as the potentially highly erodible soils. So as you can imagine, a lot of those kind of fall along that stream bank where we had higher slopes, different soil types. But overall, you know, it's fairly well spread out, and we don't see too much potential for HEL ground within the watershed, except for kind of those primary suspect areas. So whenever we look at HEL ground, we look at our percent slopes, the soil types, we can add all of those topics that I was just talking about. We can look at this overarching soil erosion risk. So all the way from green is low to no risk, to purple is very high, to extreme risk. So as you can see, it extremely varies throughout the watershed. When we get up into those kind of flatlands, those ag-dominated areas, we do see some low to moderate risk, you know, not much slopes, fairly well soil. But when we get down into, once again, you know, that stream corridor, we do see some of those, you know, very high soil erosion risk areas. And as you know, as most of us know, and we can all assume, majority of the watershed is more than likely tile drainage. You know, we use modeling to calculate this, so obviously we don't know where every tile is in every area, but we can pretty well assume, you know, based on the hydric soils and non-hydric soils, as well as, you know, slopes and everything I just talked about. You know, all these purple areas are more than likely fields that have tile drainage in them. So this is a great opportunity for some of those tools whenever we talk about that conservation toolbox, because some of these, you know, these tools work on tile drain systems. So there's that site characteristic there that we need. So it's an, you know, definitely a option or avenue for opportunity. So whenever we look into, you know, productivity, so we have our CSR2 ratings, which is the corn suitability rating. We see the average of the watershed is about 78. So that's pretty good. If you look at those greens and yellows, those are our upper CSR ratings. Obviously, those darker greens, you know, you're talking 60 and above, and real dark is the 80 to 100. But overall, the watershed is fairly productive, which is, you know, as we would assume, very ag dominated. But as you can see, it's productivity. So we want to farm what we can and you know, get our best production that we can. So when we look at current land use, right? So right off the top, I guess on the left here, it kind of shows a chart that I have that has broken down some of the majority of the land use areas. And then the right is kind of a map that represents that. So, you know, as I can just talk, and we were talking about, the watershed is very productive. So as you can guess, you know, corn and soybeans make up about 88% of the watershed. And that's, you know, that's just shy of 23,000 acres. Grass and pasture, we see about 6%, 1,500 acres. Some forested, watered wetlands, developed areas, and others kind of take up that remainder. But most of that stuff is focused along that stream corridor or the southern end of the watershed, as ag and corn and soybeans pretty much dominate, you know, the northern half to the majority of the rest of the watershed. So like I mentioned earlier, whenever we're talking about conservation and we want to know our goals, we're creating this roadmap. We know where we are, and we know where we want to be. How do we get there? So this slide kind of represents, we know where we are. So this slide kind of shows the current conservation within the watershed. So a lot of this was taken from roadside studies, driving around, marking areas, as well as, you know, other modeling and other project partners that have done work in the West Buttrick Creek watershed, and we could document some of this to figure out currently where we are. Excuse me. Nutrient management, it looks like we're about 1,300 acres. No-till, you know, just over 3,000. Cover crops, 200. We have one wetland, one bioreactor, you know, several 100,000 feet of grass waterways, and then you can kind of see the terraces and ponds and CRP and public land. So if we were to turn that chart into a map, this is kind of what it looks like. So we have, you know, some of those green areas are those grass waterways, the yellows are the no-tills, some of those orange fields are cover crop, that lighter green is CRP. But as you can see, that conservation is fairly well distributed throughout the watershed. A little bit more of a concentration to the southern end, you know, opening, you know, maybe those possible opportunities for that mid and northern region of the watershed. But we do have some coverage. You know, it's not like we're starting from zero. We're definitely starting from somewhere. So it's worth a pat on the back there. But there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. So when we talk about those goals, right, we can talk about the overarching, you know, goals as a bullet point, but it's nice to look at this as a data standpoint too. So what this chart shows here is the blue lines is our current reduction, right? So as you can see, nitrate, we're probably 2 to 3% there. Phosphorus, we're up there in that 14 to 13%. And soil erosion right there in that same 13 to 14%. Those gray bars represent our goals. So these goals are taken straight from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, with the 29% reduction in phosphorus and a 41% reduction in nitrogen. And as you can see, our phosphorus goals our current phosphorus reduction is quite a ways above our nitrogen. And the reason being is that in the past, we really focused on soil health, soil erosion, which partners very well with phosphorus reduction. You know, phosphorus is very tightly, you know, connected to some of those aspects. And the nitrate is kind of a tricky one. It has site-specific or practices that need to tackle those. And not all soil health practices necessarily affect a nitrate reduction. So that's why we're going to focus on that nitrate a little bit more. And as we focus on that nitrate and the phosphorus, that soil erosion goal will come with, and that's kind of that secondary benefit. So, you know, we have our goals, our current area. The kind of the end date for this, and this is just a projection, is that 2035 horizon. So that's where, you know, all this plan is based off, is that if we could, you know, follow the plan that was created, 2035 would be our end goal. Obviously, that's just a projection. You know, it'll more than likely take more than that, because that's, you know, that's probably a little bit ambitious, but we got to start somewhere and we got to set a deadline. So whenever we talk about, you know, building that toolbox to reach those goals, we wanted to really talk with the stakeholders and figure out what tools work the best, or what conservation practices have producers already been familiar with, have tried, that doesn't work as well in this watershed, or maybe is there some conservation practices that, you know, there's an education gap that producers or landowners are unfamiliar with and would just, you know, rather not do it because they're afraid of what possible impacts there could be there. And maybe changing that mindset could be important. So one way we like to kind of quantify this is we put this chart up on the wall with a large arrow on it, and it has a less likely to the left and a more likely to the right. And we had those producers kind of do a brainstorm. You know, it was a family operation or a single individual. They came up with, you know, all the conservation practices they can think of. So if you look up on there on some of those sticky notes, there's a lot of duplicates because each farmer put their own up there. But you see no-till and wetlands and bioreactors and cover crops, grassed waterways, saturated buffers. So what they did is they went up there and stuck these sticky notes on the board. And they stuck them along that chart. Is this practice less likely or more likely to be adopted? So when we go back and we can look at this, we can figure out, you know, what practices fell on that likely side and which one of those can we pick out that have, you know, large impacts, and we know that they're more likely to be adopted because the stakeholders told us so. So we can focus on some of those practices to make it easier for those producers because they already know that this one works. You know, as well as we can look back to, is there some of these practices that we know do work in the watershed, because there has been individuals that tried them, but for some reason they ranked on that less likely aspect. So what we can kind of figure out there, is there an education gap? Is there a funding gap? You know, what could be holding that practice back to the left side of the chart when really it could possibly on the right side of the chart and provide, you know, a very good benefit to the watershed for those soil and water conservation goals. So when we think about, you know, conservation practices, I like to refer to this conservation pyramid, right? So at the bottom, obviously we have soil health, right? It's the framework, it's the baseboard to, you know, soil and water conservation. You know, above that we have in-field. So these two, you know, if we don't have these two, we can't hold the pyramid, right? But it's also representative that it takes a lot of soil health and a lot of in-field practices that have the same impact as what you'd have as some of these practices that fall on the top of the pyramid. Obviously, we don't need as many of these to maybe have the same impact as we do some of these in-field and soil health. But some of these practices like edge of field, so bioreactors, saturated buffers, and in-stream like wetlands or ponds are pretty site specific. So they don't work everywhere. They can only work in certain spots, but they have a great impact. So, you know, we may only need a few of these practices, but to really get to our goals, we're going to need a lot of this soil health and in-field, as well as putting these practices in the majority of the areas that we can make them work. So now whenever we talk about that, okay, so essentially we've built that toolbox, right? We know what tools we want to use, we know our goals. So now let's kind of figure out how many conservation practices is it going to take us to get toward that ending goal. And we use a modeling program that's called ACPF. It's the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. So what that can do is look at the landscape in the watershed and figure out, you know, this conservation practices have these site characteristics. How many areas in that watershed would those practices work? And then from there, we kind of do some fine tuning to figure out, you know, how many of each practice do we need to reach that 41% nitrate and that 29% phosphorus. So if we start at the top here, we have nutrient management. You know, this plan is recommending, you know, just over 13,000 acres, which is all corn acres. No-till on all the soybean acres, cover crops on all the soybean, plus 50% of the corn, which comes in about 16,000 acres there. We have some as-needed stuff in there. Wetlands, we have 6 of them. Saturated buffers, 90. And then grass waterways is kind of an as-needed for erosion control aspect. Grass waterways have already been pretty well adopted in the watershed, so we didn't feel a need to maybe put an exact goal on it. It's kind of an as needed if a site has a characteristic where we have some surface erosion, that landowner can definitely implement grass waterways into that. So here's kind of that chart represented in a map. And before I dig into this too much, I want to, kind of clarify. I keep referring to this roadmap, right? So, we're starting on this road trip, and we know where we want to end. And there's a lot of different paths to get, right? Anyone that's taken a road trip knows that there's different routes, and one's faster, one's slower, but one may have less traffic and so on. So whenever I look at that, and we created, essentially one route here, right? So there's obviously different ways to do this. But for us to start and get that ball rolling and figure out, exactly what it's going to take, we had to pick a route. And from our aspect, we think this could be one of the best routes to take, but it definitely can be tweaked. We can definitely change routes as we're going. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that just because there's a purple dot on your field or a wetland there doesn't mean that has to be it. There's different options. So if we look at this, obviously we see a lot of green fields. So that's that cover crops, those infield practices. And then if you were to peel everything back, you would see orange fields everywhere. That's that soil health. That's that base of that conservation pyramid. We need to have that on all ag acres where we can. All the purple dots kind of represent, saturated buffers and bioreactors. The squiggly lines on the streams would be the saturated buffers. The dots out in the field would be your bioreactors. You can see some of the wetlands, and then as well as the wetland drainage. So that's that gray kind of hazy area that would be upstream from those wetlands. So lastly, whenever we want to put this into context, it's nice to look at kind of some dollar amounts. And this is just some estimations, right? So like I was mentioning before, I'm a conservationist, not an accountant, but I'd love to talk to you about this stuff. So this is kind of just some ballpark numbers we put together. It definitely helps me wrap my head around what we're talking about here. And I know I've heard this from others too, that it makes it a little bit easier to kind of realize what we're looking at. So when we look at the annual budget, so the annual budget to follow, this route or this watershed plan that we came up with today to 2035 would be about, just slightly over $486,000. So within that $486,000, there's $100,000 in there calculated for technical assistance. So that could be, or what it's assumed to be is a coordinator, as well as outreach, maybe equipment. It can be a variety of things. Of $100,000 a year is set aside to fund that, to kind of help farmers, tackle and follow this watershed plan. The additional $386,000 is focused on those yearly practices, no-till, cover crops, and a variety of those practices that kind of turn over each year, and cost share may be optional or available for producers to tap into. So when we look at those long-term projects, those more permanent projects, or those conservation practices that we put in once, they have a longer lifespan. That's kind of where this second number comes in. So it's about 1.6 million is what would take from our start date to 2035 to cover all of the installations of those permanent practices that are those saturated buffers, bioreactors, wetlands, ponds, and that's the overall capital that would be needed to tackle all of those. So those numbers, it's hard to reference those. What can we reference those to? I mean, to me, they seem, it's a lot of money, right? And it is. But if we can kind of take a step back and put them in context, what we've done is we can actually, roughly calculate the gross annual revenue for the watershed. So how I did that was taking the corn and soybean acres, average price for corn and soybeans, and then calculated that out to figure out on average about what does the watershed make gross revenue, not net revenue, because it's almost impossible for us to figure out what are those input costs. But that's about 15.8 million is what the watershed makes on a gross annual revenue. So if we incorporate that into the annual budget, that's about just over 3% of that annual revenue is what it would take to maintain this watershed plan to 2035. Now, when we look down to the capital, the overall capital needed for the whole project, what we did is we kind of calculated this farmland asset value. So what we did is we figured out those ag acres, what was the average acre selling for. In 2018, I believe, was the most current data we could find. And we kind of calculated that out to $182 million is the farmland asset value for West Buttrick Creek, using the most current data we had available. So when we relate that back to that almost $1.6 million capital that's needed, that's about 0.87% of the asset value. So like I said, these numbers are gross. This is gross annual revenue, as well as, some calculated farmland asset values. So this, this can be an opportunity of, yeah, maybe we could do that. We're not talking 2 years here, 5 years, we're talking 20, 35, so 15 years. But also this could be an avenue to show to potential project funders, we've got this calculated out, we know what it's going to cost, as well as here's how it kind of overlays to our current annual revenue and our asset value. We're going to need some cost share or maybe some other type of project partnership that can help our farmers, start that initial cost share, get their feet wet, get their conservation ball rolling, and, hopefully, make that horizon bright. But that is really all I had for today's overview. Like I mentioned, please send me a chat question if you have any questions here. But here's my contact information. Please send me an email. Give me a phone call if you want to chat about some of the stuff I talked about today. Please do. Or if you disagree or maybe have some suggestions, please call me. I'm always looking to better these watershed plans. I want them to be as successful as you all do. So whatever we can do to tweak these and make them so that they're practical and doable for the watershed, that's even better. One last thing I wanted to mention to everyone is that this webinar this morning is being recorded, and it'll be on Iowa Soybeans website, as well as the full watershed plan itself. So today, I just scratched the surface of the watershed plan. It is an extremely in-depth document, and that if you want to go in there, read that watershed plan, if you have any questions, please give me a call, and that would be great. On the ISA website, you can go look under print materials and resources, then there's watershed plans, and you can find the West Buttrick watershed plan. And I think that's all I have for today. Once again, I understand it's a busy time of year, and I really appreciate you all logging in. Please go look at that watershed plan. Call me if you have any questions. I don't want to steal any more of your time, so it's greatly appreciated. And you all have a safe harvest, and I look forward to hopefully talking to some of you. Thank you.